Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition. We turned out a poem 586. We talked as girls do. Now, of course, let's just point out that our series is called Chats with Emily for a number of reasons. One of those is this use of the word talked. By the way, the we of this poem is fascinating. If we're assuming that one of the we's is Emily, then who is the other? Maybe it's Sue, her pal, sometimes lover, as some have argued. And the idea of girls will be for us also interesting. In 25 different poems, girl or girl-like is mentioned. And you'll maybe remember in 199 when we did that poem, I'm wife, I finished that. That other state, I'm czar, I'm woman now, it's safer so. How odd the girl's life looks behind this soft eclipse. I think the earth feels so to folks in heaven now. This being comfort then, that other kind was pain, and why compare? I'm wife. Stop there. As we said in our study, another remarkably ironic poem, given Emily never actually was a wife. This is another friendship poem. It's also another loss poem. So the poem is going to start out kind of happy, and it's going to end sad, or at least uncertain as to exactly what happens at the end of the poem. Our assumptions are that you have been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily is our playlist, as we said. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our set of introductory comments. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our preceding 585 poems. We just finished with 585. I like to see it lap the miles. Of course, the background information here will be significant. Note the repetition of the word we in this poem some 6 times. We talked as girls do, fond and late. We speculated fair on every subject but the grave of ours, none affair. We handled destinies as cool as we disposers be, and God a quiet party to our authority. But fondest dwelt upon ourself, as we eventually be, when girls to women softly raised, we occupy degree. We parted with a contract to cherish and to write, but heaven made both impossible before another night. Now, many have read this poem as like, whoa, like, why is it impossible that they can no longer communicate at the end of the poem by the next day? Many have read this as the person with whom she was chatting or talking died, and so was unable to ever be together. Of course, it is possible as well that she's speaking here hyperbolically, and she was never able to be with that person and chat with that person. Again, a reading of this other interlocutor as Sue comes to mind. Notice, we talk as girls do. Did you notice girls capitalized here? Right? And what is that? What is it that girls, how they talk? By the way, in 593, you'll remember Somber Girl, right? Again, as we said, 25 poems. Emily plays that game of talking about girls or girl-like. Fond, in other words, friendship, and late into the night. We, notice the, again, repetition of this we speculated fair. In other words, we talked about looking at the future on every subject but the grave. This poem will end with death, many have read it as, okay? But of ours, none affair. In other words, we were young, we were girls, we weren't women, and so we didn't have to worry about death. So we were just having this amazing conversation. We handled, it's amazing, we go from talking to handling. We handled destinies so as cool. In other words, again, back, we're talking about the future, speculating on the future, as we disposers be. In other words, as if we were disposers, right? As if we had some control of the future. And God, the first mention that we'll get to heaven later, and God, a quiet party to our authority. Whoa, some have read this as iconoclastic, as blasphemous even. In other words, we had these conversations about the future, and we didn't even consider whether God was in part of the conversation or not. God stood by and allowed for our conversation to be all the authority that we needed. But, notice the but, fondest dwelt upon ourself, right? Notice we go from fond to fondest, right? Dwelt upon ourself as we eventually be. In other words, girls talking, speculating on the future means they're speculating on no longer being girls, but women, okay? When girls to women softly raised, we, by the way, notice all these dashes. It's as if it's jolting almost. We occupy degree. In other words, she seems to be saying, as we would be eventually women, right? And then what kind of degree would we occupy? Now, degree here doesn't have to mean academic degree, although it could. And some have speculated this is a poem about Emily when she was away at school, having a girl who was a friend and a roommate. We parted. By the way, I think standing behind this poem is Byron's When We Two Parted. Maybe we'll finish with that reading. With a contract. Now, some have read this as contract, meaning what? Like, what kind of contract? Well, we're arguing here a promise, maybe, of a kind. To cherish and to write. In other words, we're going to continue this conversation, but we won't be able to ever do it again face to face, so let's make sure we write to each other. But, notice the second and important but of the poem, heaven made both impossible. Whoa, 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 both what? Oh, to cherish and to write. Well, why can't she cherish? Well, this is why many have read this poem as because the person that she was chatting with was gone. Gone? What do you mean gone? Well, probably one easy explanation is she died. She died very quickly after this conversation to be had. By the way, we're going to pick up with this word heaven in the next poem of 587. There it'll be the heaven strip. And then we're going to see it again in 588. I suppose to heaven. So there will be a number of referencing here to this idea of heaven. Of course, the idea is she died, she went to heaven. Notice heaven, of course, being referencing again God. In other words, God stood and watched as we had this conversation, but then God took over and took away the one I cared for, the other girl, and off she went. At 2a, what are we going to say about this in terms of messages? I think her argument is that friendship is fragile. And we take it for granted. And we think that we have something that will last forever. And of course, often it can't last forever, right? At 2b, I think there's a number of ways to read this poem. I think there are ways that you could argue that the girls in the poem are actually the two Emilys. There's the Emily of the scene Emily, the Emily of the interior, the Emily of the artist, the poet. Obviously, we can read this as it is written, as she had a pal. She was very close to that pal. They had amazing conversations. And then that pal was taken away from her by heaven, maybe. Or it was allowed, anyway. And again, the repetition of we, to give a sense of unity in this poem, I think is powerful. The idea as well of God somehow being responsible for the departure could turn this into a theodicy of a kind, asking, why must my friends go away? Emily will say in another poem, parting is all we know of sorrow and all we need of hell. The idea that death is a terrible theme. At 3a, I can't help but think of a couple of romantic poets that's possibly standing behind Emily's thinking here. Keats, John Keats, the great romantic poet, will be writing Bright Star, we believe, the night before he dies. We've given full lectures on this poem at learnstrong.net. The other poem that comes to mind is Lord Byron's, we mentioned it, When We Two Parted. And I think it's very possible that this poem is standing, but I want to point out as I read this, the difference in the tone. Notice that in Emily's poem, there doesn't seem to be the powerful emotionality of Lord Byron. When we two parted in silence and tears, half broken-hearted to sever for years, pale grew thy cheek and cold, colder thy kiss. Truly that hour foretold sorrow to this. The dew of the morning sunk chill on my brow. It felt like the warning of what I feel now. Thy vows are all broken, and light is thy frame. I hear thy name spoken and share in its shame. They name thee before me, a knell to mine ear, a shudder comes o'er me. Why wert thou so dear? They know not I knew thee, who knew thee so well. Long, long I shall rue thee, too deeply to tell. In secret we met, in silence I grieve, that thy heart could forget, thy spirit deceive. If I should meet thee after long years, how should I greet thee? With silence and tears. Finally, at 3b, to own a poem like this, when was a time that you had a close relationship and it ended abruptly, and for that you were sad? Thank you.